Hello, in this video I want to analyze main flaws and assets that great powers currently have. This video is primarily based on Benedikt Frey's book, How Progress Ends. So let's start with the US. US has many advantages. It has a strong network of allies. It is isolated by two oceans. It also has a lot of oil. But currently, the US has a very unstable foreign policy. And it's not clear in what direction the US policy is going to go in the future. It's not clear who will replace Trump, nor is it really clear who the Democratic nominee is going to be for the next president. But I would argue that threatening your long-term allies is very bad, just from the perspective of American empire, just from the perspective of spreading American influence all around the world. And Henry Kissinger even says in his book, The World Order, that great powers need to have some kind of ideology to be truly successful in projecting their power. It can't be just we want to take your resources because we can. The closest to that kind of ideology were the fascistic regimes, although even Hitler tried to actually say that he was protecting Europe from Bolshevism and stuff like that. But yeah, I agree with the critique that Trump is essentially trying to apply Wall Street principles on geopolitics, which is not good, and the price of dollar is going down. And one way to see the flaw of this policy is to contrast this policy with the Cold War policies of both the US and the Soviet Union, in which they were desperately trying to actually boost their reputation all around the world. The Soviets helped Egypt by building the Aswan Dam and spending millions of dollars on that. The US also spent billions of dollars just on helping Europe and many other countries around the world. The Trump administration, on the one hand, seems to be abandoning its long-term allies, and at the same time it wants to intervene all around the world. Perhaps in Iran, in Venezuela, maybe in the South China Sea, although American policy towards Taiwan is not really clear. And I would argue if the US continues to go in this direction of alienating its allies, then I think that the closest historical comparison to a great superpower destroying its own network of allies is Yeltsin's Russia leaving the Soviet Union. Yeah, people often forget, but it was actually Yeltsin who left the Soviet Union because at the time there was a military coup against Gorbachev, and that was the best way for him to get control of the Russian military. From that perspective, that was a good move, but from the perspective of Russian power, it was a catastrophe. But yeah, the US definitely, I would say, has a history of sometimes making very reckless foreign policy move, like the Iraq War, and Trump is in a way mirroring that very reckless foreign policy, but this time by a combination of isolationism towards Europe and interventionism pretty much everywhere else. Okay, now the EU. The EU on paper is very powerful in theory. It has a lot of population. It has powerful economies in it when you look at GDP. Even when you look at purchasing power parity, it's doing okay, but it doesn't have its own military. So I would argue the military is the weakest point of the EU, because the EU is not a military alliance. And also the EU is very, very dependent on the US. Here you can see how much artillery Russia produces. So the estimate is 3 to 4.5 million shells. And the EU, so actually all the NATO European countries produce somewhere around 2.5 million rounds of artillery. So the production target for 2026 for the EU NATO countries is 2.5 million rounds. Then the satellites. The EU is very much reliant on American satellites. Russia has at least 110 military satellites. European NATO members operate 49 military satellites, and the US has 246 military satellites. So the EU definitely needs to do something about its reliance on the US. That is its main weakness, and also the EU is just very disunified. That's also its main weakness. But now I would like to say something about China. I would argue that China has the opposite problem of the US. So in its foreign policy, it's actually not doing that bad currently, but internally it has many weaknesses. So China actually in its foreign policy is much more careful than both Russia and the US. Why do I say that? Well, ever since the Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979, China didn't really attack any country. Chinese imperialism is mostly economical. And we can even see that as a result of that invasion, Vietnam is today de facto an American ally after all the horrible things that the US did in Vietnam. That is kind of darkly humorous, one could say. But yeah, I agree with the interpretation that China pretty much learned a lesson from that and is very rarely intervening militarily. It is essentially stealing parts of the South China Sea, but I would argue that's different from land invasions like Russia attacking Ukraine or the US attacking Iraq or doing an invasion of Venezuela. Benedikt Frey argues that the main advantage that China has over all the other countries currently is the AI. China is very strong when it comes to AI because it's a huge state with a very centralized economy, so it has access to a lot of data, and AIs are trained on data, which is why AI experts actually call China the Saudi Arabia of data. Data is here, you could say, a metaphor for oil. But it still remains unclear how big of a deal that is actually. The AIs are still very flawed. They can hallucinate, they can sometimes tell you just false things, and it wouldn't be wise as of right now to give too much power to AIs. So as of right now, we still actually cannot really assume that AIs will be the most important factor in this struggle for power that's happening between great powers. But something disturbing has been happening in China lately. A new wave of purges has been happening, reminiscent of the cultural revolution and Mao Zedong. So President Xi Jinping has been purging generals in China. Why is that happening? Some will tell you it's because of corruption. China has a long history of fighting corruption. Even in the 2010s, this gentleman here, Chu Chai-hu, a famous Chinese general, was arrested, and somewhere around $20 million of cash was found in his basement. So China is very harsh when it comes to corruption, because in a authoritarian state, the government actually needs to send a message that corruption will not be allowed by the party, because the only mechanism that the state has in fighting corruption is the party leadership doing it in a very brutal way. There are no independent courts actually exist. Also, some of the most powerful CEOs in China have recently disappeared. Some committed suicide, or at least we have been told that they either committed suicide or died from some illness. So yeah, I do think that a great purge is currently happening. Xi Jinping is trying to replace existing bureaucracy with his loyalists. That's what many analysts argue, and in the long run, that will be bad for China, in the same way in which the purges that happened in the Cultural Revolution were bad. Why were they bad? Because experts and highly educated people were replaced with loyalists. The only Chinese general that still had military experience was recently proclaimed to be guilty of corruption and purged. He's either dead or in jail. And if China is really planning on attacking Taiwan, that could be disastrous, just like Stalin's great purges were. He ended up killing a lot of his best generals just before Hitler attacked him. Carl Benedikt Frey actually argues that as China recently has becoming more authoritarian, it has also been becoming less innovative compared to the US. And the simplest explanation for that is that authoritarianism and replacing educated people with loyalists will lead to less innovation. And that actually seems to make a lot of sense to me. Also, China is suffering from a really bad demographic picture. And it still remains a question, will China actually attack Taiwan? I do think that could be potentially disastrous for China, especially if the US decides to retaliate. But yeah, killing your most experienced generals just before attacking Taiwan, I do think would be a mistake. Now, you can tell me in the comment section, do you really think that China is about to invade Taiwan? I don't know, I just don't have enough data to really tell you if that's happening. But yeah, China, as of right now, in its foreign policy, is doing pretty good. It is establishing economic partnerships all around Africa. It's also moving closer to Europe economically, but internally, it's becoming more authoritarian, and that's crushing innovation. Less freedom leads to less information in circulation, and it leads to less innovation. But Russia definitely takes the title of making the biggest mistake in recent history. I would argue the US and China are also doing some bad things. But Russia, as we know, recently decided to invade Ukraine. And you can tell me that perhaps Putin didn't believe that the war will be over immediately, but he definitely didn't plan on this war lasting for 4 years. And recently there were many bad developments happening for Russia. Saudi Arabia decided to dump a lot of oil on the market, which led to the oil prices decreasing. Then just recently Elon Musk decided to end Starlink support for the Russian military, and it is pretty insane actually that the Russian military all this time depended on Starlink when you think about it. I mean, can you imagine the Soviet Union depending on American capitalist companies for their military? That would be seen as a huge humiliation, and that actually really shows how Russia is no longer a great power, I would argue. And I just read an article about Ukraine starting a new offensive in order to exploit this chaos that ensued after Elon Musk ended his support for the Russian military through Starlink. Yeah, that's definitely going to be at least a temporary problem for the Russians. And the refinery attacks keep happening. It's becoming harder and harder for Russia to replace certain parts of their refineries. And I just also read an article about India deciding to buy more oil from Venezuela and less from Russia. So I do think that ultimately this war is going to weaken Russia very much and make it dependent more on China, which is bad for Russia. But as we can see, all great powers actually suffer from some pretty big flaws. And I would say that the US is still in the best position, but yeah, it is unclear in what direction US politics is going to go. You can write in the comment section if you have an idea of where the US might be in 4 years. And if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe.